The wagon wheels groaned against the frozen earth as Ruth Whitmore clutched her worn carpet bag closer to her chest. The December wind cut through her black morning dress like a blade, and she pulled the threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. Through the swirling snow, she could barely make out the silhouette of the Hartwell Ranch, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the base of the Wind River Range like orphaned children seeking shelter. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat from the driver's seat. "Mrs. Whitmore, I must remind you that Mr. Hartwell is particular about his solitude. He only agreed to this arrangement because I pressed upon him your dire circumstances." Ruth nodded, though her throat tightened. 3 weeks had passed since the mine explosion that took Samuel, and the company had wasted no time evicting her from their housing. With winter settling over Wyoming territory like a burial shroud, she had nowhere else to turn. The wagon lurched to a stop before a 2-story log house, its windows dark as empty eye sockets. A figure emerged from the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate gait of a man who'd forgotten how to hurry. Caleb Hartwell's face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but Ruth could feel the weight of his reluctance in every step. "Reverend," Caleb said, his voice rough as sandpaper. He didn't acknowledge Ruth directly, keeping his gray eyes fixed on the minister. "Mr. Hartwell, may God bless you for your charity. Mrs. Whitmore has suffered a terrible loss, and the old stable house." Caleb cut him off, gesturing toward a small structure 50 yards from the main house. "It's been cleaned out. There's a stove and a cot. She can stay there." Ruth's heart sank, but she kept her chin raised. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, especially with the secret growing beneath her corset, a secret that would surely see her cast out entirely if discovered. Reverend Thomas's face reddened. "Surely, in this weather, the main house would be more—" "The stable house," Caleb repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Or nothing." Ruth placed a gentle hand on the Reverend's arm. "It's perfectly adequate. Reverend Thomas, I'm grateful for any shelter." For the first time, Caleb's eyes flickered to her face. Something passed across his features. Surprise, perhaps, at her easy acceptance, but it vanished as quickly as morning frost touched by sunlight, after the Reverend departed with promises to check on her come spring. Ruth stood alone in the stable house, surveying her new quarters. It was clean, as promised, but spartanly furnished. A narrow cot with a straw mattress occupied one corner, a pot-bellied stove another. A rough table and single chair completed the inventory. Through the single window, she could see the main house, lamplight glowing warmly in what must be the kitchen. Her stomach cramped, not from hunger, though she'd eaten little in days, but from the life stirring within her. She pressed a protective hand to her belly, whispering a prayer that the child would wait until spring to arrive. By then, perhaps she could find work in town, somewhere to go before her condition became obvious. The first night was brutal. Despite the stove, cold seeped through every crack and crevice. Ruth huddled beneath the thin blanket Caleb had left, fully dressed, her teeth chattering. When dawn finally broke, she forced herself from bed and ventured outside to the well. The ranch stretched before her in the pale morning light, austere and unforgiving as its owner. Beyond the main buildings, the land rolled toward the mountains in waves of white and gray, beautiful in its desolate way, but merciless to the unprepared. She was struggling to break the ice on the well bucket when she heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Caleb approached, carrying an axe over his shoulder. He stopped several feet away, as if she might be contagious. "Breakfast is at 6, supper at 5. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. "You'll eat in the kitchen. When you're done, you go back to your quarters." "Yes, Mr. Hartwell." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her chapped hands and the shadows beneath her eyes. "Can you cook? Yes? Clean? Of course. Then you'll earn your keep. I don't abide charity." Ruth straightened her spine. "I wouldn't expect it." Something flickered in his eyes again, that same surprise as yesterday. He turned to go, then paused. "There's an outhouse behind your building, chamber pot under the bed for nighttime." The words came out stilted, as if he'd forgotten how to speak of such domestic matters. That evening, Ruth entered the main house for the first time. The kitchen was large but cheerless, every surface scrubbed clean but devoid of any warming touch. No curtain softened the windows, no rug warmed the floor. It was a room maintained by habit, not love. Caleb was already seated at the long wooden table, staring at his empty plate. Ruth found a pot of beans and salt pork warming on the stove, day-old biscuits in a covered basket. She served him first, then herself. Taking the chair at the far end of the table, they ate in absolute silence. Ruth bowed her head in a brief prayer of thanks, and when she looked up, caught Caleb watching her. He immediately dropped his gaze to his plate. The pattern continued for days, breakfast and supper in oppressive quiet, Caleb disappearing to work the ranch in between. Ruth began taking on household tasks without being asked, washing dishes, sweeping floors, mending a torn shirt she found draped over a chair. Caleb never thanked her, but she noticed he began leaving items that needed attention where she would find them. The cold was relentless. Each night, Ruth bundled herself in every piece of clothing she owned, but still shivered until exhaustion finally brought sleep. Her morning sickness, mercifully mild so far, was harder to hide. She learned to step outside quickly when the nausea struck, blaming the need for fresh air if Caleb happened to notice. It was the 8th night when disaster struck. Ruth had ventured to the well after supper, determined to wash some clothes despite the late hour. The path was icy, treacherous in the darkness. One moment she was upright, the next her feet shot out from under her. She cried out as she fell, the bucket clattering away into the snow. Pain shot through her ankle, but worse was the cramping that immediately seized her belly. "No," she gasped, curling protective arms around herself. "Please, God, no!" She tried to stand but couldn't. The cold was already seeping through her dress, and she could see her breath coming in rapid, panicked puffs. The main house seemed impossibly far away. "Help!" she called, though her pride rebelled at the weakness. "Mr. Hartwell," for long, terrifying minutes. Nothing. Then footsteps. Running. Caleb's figure appeared, lantern swinging wildly in his hand. What happened? He crouched beside her, setting the lantern in the snow. "I fell. My ankle." She couldn't finish, another cramp stealing her breath. Without hesitation, Caleb slipped one arm beneath her knees, the other around her shoulders, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Ruth gasped at the sudden contact. It was the first time anyone had touched her since Samuel's funeral. "Put your arms around my neck," he ordered gruffly. She obeyed, acutely aware of his warmth, the solid strength of his chest. His hands trembled slightly where they gripped her, and she wondered if he too was remembering what human touch felt like. He carried her not to the stable house, but to the main house, shouldering through the kitchen door. Ruth expected him to set her down there, but he continued through the house to a closed door she'd never seen opened. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then turned the knob. The room beyond was frozen in time, a woman's bedroom with rose-patterned wallpaper and white curtains. A silver brush and mirror set lay on the dresser as if waiting for their owner's return. The bed was made with a wedding ring quilt, every stitch speaking of love and care. Caleb laid Ruth gently on the bed, his face carved from stone. "Don't move," he said, and disappeared. Ruth lay still, afraid to disturb anything in this shrine to his late wife. The cramps had eased. Thank God, but her ankle throbbed. She could hear Caleb moving about the house, returning minutes later with a basin of water and clean rags. "I need to see your ankle," he said, not meeting her eyes. Ruth nodded, slowly lifting her skirt to reveal her boot. Caleb's hands were surprisingly gentle as he unlaced it, though she could see the effort it cost him. This was clearly the first time he'd tended to a woman since. "She died 2 years ago," he said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Fever took her. I couldn't save her. I'm sorry," Ruth whispered. He focused on wrapping her swollen ankle, his touch clinical now. "You'll need to stay off it for a few days. You can—" he paused, jaw working. You can stay in here tonight. It's warmer than the stable house. Mr. Hartwell, I couldn't. It's just a room, he said harshly, though the roughness seemed directed at himself rather than her. No use keeping it like a museum. He finished with her ankle and stood abruptly. I'll bring your things from the stable house. After he left, Ruth lay in the bed that had once held another woman's dreams, her hand pressed to her belly where her own secret grew. The house around her was silent as a tomb, holding its breath against the winter wind. When she woke the next morning, her carpetbag sat just inside the door, and she could smell coffee brewing in the kitchen. Her ankle still hurt, but the night had passed without further cramping. She offered a prayer of thanks, then carefully made her way to the kitchen. Caleb stood at the stove, his broad back to her. Without turning, he said, "You'll stay in the house until that ankle heals proper. The stable house is too cold anyway." Ruth sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell." He finally turned, and for just a moment, she saw something raw and wounded in his gray eyes. Then the shutters came down again, and he was once more the distant, grieving rancher who'd reluctantly opened his home to a stranger. But something had shifted in the night. The silence between them at breakfast felt different, still heavy, but no longer impenetrable. And when Ruth bowed her head to pray, she thought she saw Caleb's lips moving slightly, as if remembering words he'd long forgotten how to say. The days settled into a rhythm as Ruth's ankle slowly healed. Caleb had moved her few belongings into a small room adjacent to the kitchen, not his wife's room, which remained closed again, but a space that might have once belonged to a housekeeper. It was plain but warm, and Ruth was grateful for the proximity to the stove. She took over the cooking entirely, learning Caleb's preferences through trial and observation. He liked his coffee black and bitter, his beans well salted, his biscuits without a hint of sweetness. Simple fare for a man who'd forgotten that food could be more than sustenance. The work helped distract from her growing anxiety. Each morning brought new challenges in concealing her condition. The nausea was manageable, but her dresses were beginning to strain at the waist. She let out seams by candlelight, praying the alterations wouldn't be noticed. Caleb, for his part, seemed to inhabit the house like a ghost. He spoke only when necessary, ate mechanically, and disappeared into the white wilderness each day to tend his cattle and horses. But Ruth noticed small changes. He'd begun leaving split wood by the kitchen door without being asked. Fresh game appeared on the kitchen table, rabbits, the occasional deer haunch. Once, she found a jar of preserved peaches in the pantry with a note. From town. It was during the third week that Ruth discovered the grave. She'd ventured outside on a mild afternoon, her ankle finally bearing weight without protest. Behind the house, partially hidden by a stand of cottonwoods, she found a small fenced area. A single wooden cross stood sentinel over a mound of earth, the name Margaret Hartwell carved deep into the wood. Ruth stood quietly, understanding flooding through her. This was why Caleb kept his distance, why the house felt more like a memorial than a home. He was still married in his heart to the woman beneath this cold earth. "You weren't supposed to find that." Ruth startled. Caleb stood behind her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "I'm sorry," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "She loved those cottonwoods," he said, his voice rough. "Planted them herself our first year here. Said every house needed shade trees, even if we wouldn't live to see them fully grown." Ruth remained silent, sensing the dam of his grief threatening to break. "The fever took her in 3 days." The words came haltingly, as if pulled from a deep well. "Doctor couldn't do nothing. I sat by her bed and watched her burn up from the inside. All my strength, all my work, useless as dust." "You loved her very much," Ruth said softly. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Love, lot of good it did her." He turned abruptly and strode back toward the barn, leaving Ruth alone with the grave and the whispering trees. That evening, she found him sitting at the kitchen table earlier than usual, staring at his hands, without speaking. She served the meal, venison stew she'd been simmering all day. fresh bread, the last of the preserved peaches. She set a plate before him and took her seat. For the first time since her arrival, Ruth didn't bow her head in silent prayer. Instead, she spoke aloud. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the shelter from the storm. We ask your blessing on this house and all who dwell within. Grant us strength for tomorrow and peace for today. Amen." When she raised her head, Caleb was looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "My mother used to pray like that," he said, "before every meal, no matter how meager." "Mine too," Ruth replied. She said gratitude was the only currency that never lost its value. They ate in companionable silence, still quiet, but warmer somehow. When Caleb finished, he didn't immediately escape to the barn as usual. Instead, he cleared his throat. "You can tend the chickens, if you've a mind to. Eggs have been scarce since—" He didn't finish, but Ruth understood. "Since Margaret died. I'd be glad to." He nodded and rose to leave, then paused at the door. "That hymn you sing in the mornings? What is it?" Ruth flushed. She hadn't realized he could hear her soft singing as she prepared breakfast. "It's nearer, my God, to thee. My mother taught it to me. Margaret sang that one too," he said quietly, and left. The next morning, Ruth found the chicken coop in sorry shape. The hens were half wild, roosting in the rafters and scattering at her approach. It took patience and a pocket full of corn to coax them down. As she worked, she hummed softly, the familiar melody soothing her nerves. She was reaching for eggs in a high nest when the ladder wobbled. Her ankle, still weak, gave way. She fell hard, landing on her side in the straw. Pain shot through her middle, sharp and terrifying. "No, no, no!" she gasped, curling around her belly. This couldn't happen. Not here. Not now. The barn door crashed open. Caleb took in the scene in an instant. Ruth on the ground, her face twisted in pain, her arms wrapped protectively around her middle. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Without a word, he knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly. "How far along?" 4 months, maybe 5. Ruth managed between gritted teeth. His face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "Can you stand?" She tried, but another cramp seized her. Caleb made a decision. Once again, he gathered her into his arms. But this time his touch was different, careful, almost reverent. He carried her to the house and laid her on her bed. "Don't move," he ordered. "I'll heat water." For the next hour, he tended to her with surprising competence. Warm compresses for her cramping belly, pillows beneath her knees, a cup of tea made from herbs she didn't recognize. Slowly, mercifully, the pains eased. "The baby?" she whispered. "Moving?" he asked. Ruth concentrated, then nodded as she felt the familiar flutter. "Yes. Then likely all's well. But you need rest. No more ladders, no more heavy work." He sat back on his heels, studying her with those gray eyes that suddenly seemed less cold. "Why didn't you tell me? Would you have let me stay?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "But you're here now." That night, a blizzard struck with renewed fury. Wind howled around the house like a living thing, and snow piled against the windows. Ruth lay wakeful, listening to the storm and thinking of Samuel. He'd been so excited when she told him about the baby, making plans for a cradle, choosing names. Now he was cold in the ground, and she was here in this strange house with a grieving man who'd shown her more kindness in an hour of crisis than in all the weeks before. She heard footsteps in the kitchen and rose carefully, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Caleb sat at the table with a cup of coffee, staring at the frosted window. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. He glanced at her, then gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, and he poured her a cup of tea from the pot he'd apparently prepared. "Margaret lost 3 babies," he said suddenly. "Too early on, like today. 1 lived a day." His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white around his cup. She blamed herself, said God was punishing her for something. I told her that was foolishness, but— He shrugged helplessly. It wasn't her fault, Ruth said firmly. Sometimes these things just happen. I know that. Knew it then. But knowing don't make it easier. He met her eyes. Your husband? The mine? Ruth nodded. 3 weeks ago, we'd only just found out about the baby. He was saving every penny for when it came. Her voice caught. The company said it wasn't their fault. Gave me 3 days to vacate company housing. Caleb's expression darkened. Bastards, he muttered, then caught himself. Pardon. No pardon needed. That's what they are. They sat in comfortable silence, the storm raging outside while the kitchen remained a pocket of warmth and calm. Finally, Caleb spoke again. You'll stay until the baby comes. After that, he trailed off, but Ruth understood. After that, they'd see. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded and rose to leave, then paused. My mother's old trunk is in the attic. Might be some baby things in there, if the moths haven't got them. As he disappeared into the darkness of the house, Ruth placed a protective hand over her belly. For the first time since Samuel's death, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Perhaps God hadn't abandoned her after all. Perhaps he'd simply led her to this broken man who understood grief as intimately as she did. The storm raged for 2 more days, sealing them inside together. Caleb showed her Margaret's sewing basket, admitted he couldn't mend worth a damn. Ruth took over his pile of torn clothes, working by lamplight while he read from a worn Bible, the first time she'd seen him with a book. On the 3rd day, when the snow finally stopped, Caleb dug a path to the barn and returned with news that all the animals had survived. That evening at supper, he cleared his throat awkwardly. That hymn you sing, would you... He stopped, started again. Would you sing it? Proper. I mean, not just humming. Ruth's throat tightened, but she nodded, in a clear, soft voice. She sang, Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee, e'en though it be a cross that raiseth me. When she finished, Caleb's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Thank you, he said roughly, and fled to the barn. But the next morning, when Ruth began her usual humming, she heard something that made her pause. From somewhere in the house came a low, rusty baritone, joining her melody. It was uncertain, full of pain, but it was there. Caleb Hartwell was remembering how to sing. The false spring came in late February, melting the snow enough to make the roads passable. Ruth watched from the kitchen window as the first wagon in weeks struggled up the muddy track toward the ranch. Her heart sank when she recognized Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, the town's most devoted gossip. Perched beside her husband on the seat, Caleb emerged from the barn, his face setting into hard lines as he recognized the visitors. Ruth quickly smoothed her apron over her now obvious condition and prepared to face the inevitable. Mr. Hartwell! Mrs. Fletcher called out before her husband had even helped her down. We heard you'd taken in a boarder and thought we'd come see if you needed anything from town. Her sharp eyes found Ruth in the doorway immediately, taking in every detail from her morning dress to her swollen middle. Ruth could practically see the calculations spinning behind those eyes. Mrs. Fletcher, Caleb said curtly. We need nothing. But the woman was already sweeping toward the house, her husband trailing apologetically behind. You must be the widow Whitmore. Such a tragedy about your husband. When is your confinement? Late spring, Ruth answered quietly, knowing it was useless to evade. And you're staying here, alone, with Mr. Hartwell? The questions dripped with false concern. Caleb stepped between them. Mrs. Whitmore is my housekeeper. The Reverend arranged it. Now, if you'll excuse us. Of course, of course. Mrs. Fletcher's smile was sharp as broken glass. It's just that people will talk. You understand. A young widow. A widower. Appearances matter, Mr. Hartwell. Then people should mind their own business, Caleb said flatly. Good day, Mrs. Fletcher. After they left, Ruth sank into a kitchen chair, her hands shaking. She'll tell everyone. Let her, Caleb said, but his jaw was tight with anger. Bunch of hypocrites, the lot of them. But Ruth knew it wasn't that simple. By week's end, the Reverend himself appeared at their door, his kind face creased with concern. "I've had some concerns raised," he began delicately, seated at their kitchen table, "about the propriety of the current arrangement." "You arranged it yourself," Caleb reminded him coldly. "Yes, but that was before." The Reverend's eyes flickered to Ruth's middle. "Perhaps Mrs. Whitmore would be more comfortable with the widow Jensen in town. She takes in boarders, and—" "Widow Jensen, who turned her away in December?" Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "Who said she didn't want that type in her Christian home?" The Reverend flushed. "I wasn't aware." "No, you weren't. Just like you weren't aware that your good Christian townspeople would rather see a pregnant woman freeze than risk their precious reputations." Caleb stood, looming over the smaller man. "Mrs. Whitmore stays here until she chooses to leave. That's final." After the Reverend fled, Ruth found Caleb in the barn, attacking a pile of wood with unnecessary violence. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He paused, axe raised. "Yes, I did." He brought the axe down with a crack that split the log clean through. "Margaret faced the same judgment when we first married. She was from back east, too refined for ranch life. They said, wouldn't last the winter." His voice grew fierce. "She proved them all wrong." That night, as if in response to the town's judgment, winter returned with a vengeance. Ruth woke to the familiar cramping pain, but this time it was different, deeper, more insistent. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, but a whimper escaped. Footsteps in the hall, then Caleb's voice through the door. "Ruth?" It was the first time he'd used her given name. I think the baby's coming." The door burst open. Caleb took one look at her pale face and moved into action. "Too early," he muttered, lighting lamps, building up the fire. "Still 6 weeks too early." "I know," Ruth gasped as another pain gripped her. "The doctor won't make it in this snow?" His face was grim but determined. "I've delivered calves and foals. It can't be that different." Despite her pain, Ruth almost laughed at that. But as the hours wore on and the pains intensified, she was grateful for his steady presence. He never faltered, never showed the fear she could see lurking in his eyes. When the baby finally came, too small and too quiet, Caleb's hands were the first to hold him. For a terrifying moment, there was silence. Then a thin, reedy cry filled the room, and Ruth sobbed with relief. "He's small," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "But he's fighting." He cleaned the baby with gentle efficiency, then wrapped him in a soft blanket he'd retrieved from somewhere. When he placed the infant in Ruth's arms, she saw that the blanket was beautifully embroidered, Margaret's work. "She made it for the baby that lived a day," he said quietly. "Seemed right to use it for one that's going to live a lifetime." Ruth looked up at him through tears. "How do you know?" "Because he's got your stubbornness already." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Listen to him complain. Indeed, the baby was voicing his displeasure at the cold world he'd entered, his cries growing stronger by the minute. Caleb stayed with them through the night, keeping the fire burning, heating water for cleaning, even managing to get Ruth to swallow some broth. When the baby struggled to nurse, he showed her tricks he'd learned with orphaned calves, patient and matter-of-fact. As dawn broke, the snow had stopped. The baby slept peacefully against Ruth's breast, his breathing steady. Caleb sat slumped in the chair beside the bed, exhausted but watchful. "You should rest," Ruth told him. He shook his head. "Not yet. Need to make sure." "We're fine," she assured him. "Thanks to you." He looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. "What will you call him?" Ruth gazed down at her son's tiny face. "Samuel, for his father, but—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "Samuel Caleb, if you don't mind, since you brought him safely into the world." Caleb went very still. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I'd be honored." Over the following days, the house transformed. Caleb moved Ruth and the baby into Margaret's room without discussion, saying it was warmer and more comfortable. He crafted a beautiful cradle from pine, sanding it smooth as silk. When Ruth protested that he was doing too much, he simply said, "It needs doing," and continued working. The baby, despite his early arrival, thrived. Caleb would hold him while Ruth prepared meals, talking to him seriously about cattle and weather as if the infant could understand every word. Once, Ruth caught him singing softly, not a hymn, but an old lullaby about horses and stars. "You're good with him," she said. Caleb's face shuddered. "Just making sure he survives. Come spring, you'll want to move on. Start fresh somewhere." Ruth's heart clenched, but she only nodded. Of course, this was temporary. She was foolish to think otherwise. But at night, when the baby cried, it was often Caleb who reached him first, warming a bottle of the goat's milk they supplemented with, walking the floors with Samuel against his broad chest. And in the mornings, when Ruth sang her hymns, Caleb's voice joined hers more often than not. The thaw came properly in early April. Ruth knew she should start making plans, but every time she tried to bring up leaving, something stopped her. Maybe it was the way Caleb's face lit up when Samuel gripped his finger. Maybe it was the peace she'd found in this house that had known such sorrow. Or maybe it was the way Caleb had started saying "we" instead of "I" when talking about the ranch's future. One evening, as they sat by the fire with Samuel sleeping between them, Ruth finally voiced what they'd both been avoiding. "I should go soon. The roads are clear. And why?" Caleb's question was sharp, almost angry. "Because people talk. Because it isn't proper. Because you never asked for this burden." "Burden?" He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Is that what you think you are? What else could we be?" He turned to face her, his gray eyes blazing with an emotion she couldn't name. "You brought life back to this house. You sing in the mornings. You made me remember why I bothered to wake up." "Samuel," his voice caught. "When I hold him, I remember that not everything I touch dies. Caleb, I know I'm not what you'd choose. I know I'm rough and broken and probably half mad from grief. But if you go," he stopped, running a hand through his hair, "just don't go because you think I want you to, because I don't." Ruth rose, Samuel in her arms, and crossed to stand before him. "I don't want to go," she admitted. "But staying, what would that mean?" He reached out slowly, his work-roughened hand gentle as he touched Samuel's downy head. "It would mean making a real home here, together, if you're willing." Ruth thought of the gossips, the judgment, the proper widow's grief she was supposed to display. Then she thought of this man who'd caught her baby in his capable hands, who sang lullabies when he thought no one could hear, who was looking at her now with such vulnerable hope. "I'm willing," she whispered. Relief flooded his face. He pulled them both into his arms, carefully, so carefully, and Ruth felt the last of her reservations melt away. This was where they belonged, all three of them. Not because it was proper or easy, but because broken things sometimes fit together in ways that made them whole again. The spring days lengthened into early summer, and with them came a tentative new rhythm to life at the ranch. Ruth had grown stronger. Samuel thrived, and Caleb seemed to shed years of grief like an old coat. Yet beneath the surface of their domestic peace, an unspoken tension hummed between the two adults. It started with small things, the accidental brush of hands when passing dishes, the way Caleb's eyes lingered when Ruth sang Samuel to sleep, how she found herself watching him work from the window, admiring the strength in his movements. They were dancing around something neither dared name. The afternoon it came to a head was unseasonably warm. Caleb had been working on repairing a section of fence that the winter had damaged. Ruth brought him water, Samuel sleeping in a sling across her chest. She found Caleb with his shirt off, sweat gleaming on his broad back, revealing old scars she'd never seen before. He turned at her approach, reaching for the water gratefully. "Thank you." His voice was rough from the heat and work. Ruth tried not to stare at the expanse of sun-bronzed skin, the old wounds that spoke of a hard life lived. One scar, longer than the others, curved around his ribs. Without thinking, she reached out to touch it. Caleb went absolutely still. "I'm sorry," Ruth said quickly, pulling her hand back. "I shouldn't have." He caught her hand in his calloused palm warm against hers. "Ranch accident. Bull got me when I was young and stupid." His thumb traced small circles on her wrist. Margaret used to say it looked like a crescent moon. Ruth's pulse quickened. They stood frozen in the bright afternoon sun, hands clasped, both aware they were balanced on the edge of something irreversible. "Ruth," Caleb said, his voice low and urgent. "We should talk about—" A cry from Samuel broke the moment. Ruth stepped back, flustered, adjusting the baby's position. "I should get him inside, out of the sun." Caleb nodded, but his eyes followed her all the way back to the house. That evening, supper was awkward. They'd grown comfortable with each other over the months, but now every glance felt weighted with meaning. When their fingers touched passing the bread, both pulled back as if burned. After Samuel was settled for the night, Ruth found herself restless. The house felt too small, too full of unspoken words. She stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool evening air. The first stars were appearing, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. She heard Caleb's footsteps before she saw him. He stood beside her, careful to leave space between them. "Storm coming," he said, gesturing to clouds building on the horizon. "Yes." They stood in silence, watching lightning flicker in the distance. Finally, Caleb spoke. "I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you answer." Ruth nodded, her hands gripping the porch rail. "I know what we have now. It's good, safe, but I'm going half mad with wanting more." His voice was raw with honesty. "I watch you with Samuel, singing in the kitchen, laughing at something foolish, and I want things I swore I'd never want again. I want to hold you proper. I want to kiss you. I want—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "But I made promises. To Margaret, to God, and you lost your husband not 6 months past. It isn't right." Ruth turned to face him, her heart hammering. What if right and wrong aren't as clear as we thought? What if God brought us together not despite our losses, but because of them? Who else could understand? "Don't," his voice was strained. "Don't make it sound reasonable when I know it's just my weakness talking. Is it weakness to want to live again? To want love after loss?" Ruth stepped closer, close enough to see the war in his eyes. "I made promises too, Caleb, but Samuel would want me happy, just as Margaret would want for you." "You don't know that. I do." Ruth's voice was firm. "Because that's what love does. It wants joy for the beloved, even after death." Caleb turned away, gripping the rails so hard his knuckles went white. "If we do this, if we cross this line, everything changes." Everything already has changed. Ruth touched his arm gently. "We're just too scared to admit it." Thunder rumbled closer, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and Ruth saw her own longing reflected in his eyes. "God forgive me," he whispered, and pulled her into his arms. The kiss was desperate, months of denial pouring out in a single moment. Ruth clung to him, tasting salt and need and something like absolution. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Inside," Caleb said roughly. "Storm's here." They made it to the kitchen before the heavens opened. Rain hammered the roof as they stood facing each other, water dripping from their clothes. The air between them crackled with more than lightning. "We should," Ruth began, but Caleb kissed her again, backing her against the wall. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling pins free until it tumbled around her shoulders. "Tell me to stop," he said against her lips. "Tell me this is wrong." But Ruth couldn't, because it didn't feel wrong. It felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. She pulled him closer, her hands exploring the plains of his chest, the scars she'd wondered about. They barely made it to her room, Margaret's room, before the last barriers fell. In the darkness, lit only by flashes of lightning, They came together with desperate tenderness. Caleb whispered her name like a prayer, and Ruth answered with her whole body, her whole heart. It was nothing like her marriage bed with Samuel. That had been young love, sweet and simple. This was resurrection. Two people choosing life despite death's long shadow. Afterwards, they lay entwined, listening to the rain and their gradually slowing heartbeats. Ruth could feel Caleb's tension returning, guilt creeping back in. "Don't," she said softly, pressing a hand to his chest. "Don't ruin this with regret." "How can I not? I swore." "We're alive, Caleb. That's not a betrayal of the dead. It's a gift we shouldn't waste." He was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "I loved her so much. Ruth, when she died, I wanted to die too. Thought about it more than once." "I know," Ruth whispered. "I felt the same when Samuel died, like the world had ended. But it didn't." His arm tightened around her. "You showed me it didn't." They talked through the night as the storm raged, about their losses, their guilt, their unexpected second chance. When Samuel woke for his feeding, Caleb fetched him, bringing the baby to their bed as naturally as if he'd always done so. As dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Caleb rose and dressed, his movements careful and deliberate. "What happens now?" Ruth asked, holding Samuel close. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, taking her free hand. "Now I do what I should have done weeks ago. I court you proper. We tell people I'm courting you. And when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll marry you in front of God and everybody. People will talk more than ever. Let 'em—" His jaw set stubbornly. "They'll talk anyway. Might as well give them something true to say." Ruth smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "All right, Caleb Hartwell, court me then." He leaned in to kiss her, soft and sweet this time. "I should warn you, I'm out of practice. Might not remember all the proper steps." "Good," Ruth said. "I don't want proper. I want real." Over the following days, they navigated their new understanding carefully. In daylight, Caleb was almost formal in his courtship, bringing her wildflowers, asking permission to hold her hand, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings. But at night, when Samuel slept, they came together with increasing passion, learning each other's bodies, healing old wounds with new touch. Ruth knew they were living in a kind of suspended moment, that soon they'd have to face the world's judgment, but for now, in this house that had known such sorrow, joy was blooming like the wildflowers Caleb brought her. It was fragile and new, but it was theirs. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset with Samuel babbling between them, Caleb cleared his throat. "I have something for you." He pulled out a small, worn box. "It's not much, but—" Inside was a simple gold ring, clearly old but well-maintained. "Was it?" Ruth began. "No," Caleb said quickly. "It was my mother's. Margaret had her own. And it's buried with her. Where it belongs. This one." "Mother would have wanted it used for new love, not kept as a monument to old." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect." "You'll wear it then? Let me tell everyone you're mine." "I'm already yours," Ruth said, letting him slip the ring onto her finger. "Have been since that night you carried me in from the snow." Caleb kissed her deeply, Samuel squawking in protest at being squeezed between them. They laughed, adjusting their embrace to include the baby, and Ruth thought that perhaps this was what redemption looked like. Not the absence of sorrow, but joy growing alongside it, stubborn as prairie grass through snow. The news of their engagement spread through the valley like wildfire. Within days of Caleb's visit to town for supplies, where he'd made a point of mentioning his intentions to marry Mrs. Whitmore, the ranch saw more visitors than it had in 2 years. Most came under the pretense of neighborly concern. Mrs. Fletcher arrived first, her pinched face barely concealing her disapproval as she took in Ruth's ring and the baby playing on a blanket nearby. "Well," she said, her teacup rattling against its saucer, "this is rather sudden, isn't it? Your poor husband barely cold in his grave." Ruth kept her voice steady. "It's been 7 months. Mrs. Fletcher, I'll mourn Samuel for the rest of my life. But I also have a child to think of. Indeed. The woman's eyes glittered with malicious curiosity. And Mr. Hartwell is willing to take on another man's child. How charitable. Before Ruth could respond, Caleb entered from the kitchen. He'd been listening, she realized, waiting to intervene if needed. Samuel will be my son in every way that matters, he said firmly. Just as Ruth will be my wife. Now, Mrs. Fletcher, I believe you are leaving. The woman departed in a huff, but she was far from the last. Over the following weeks, they endured a parade of visitors, each finding subtle or not so subtle ways to express their judgment. The men clapped Caleb on the back with knowing looks that made Ruth's cheeks burn. The women whispered behind their hands, their eyes calculating the timeline between her widowhood and this sudden engagement. The worst came on a Sunday when they attempted to attend church together for the first time. Reverend Thomas welcomed them warmly enough, but Ruth felt the congregation's stares like physical weight. When she stood to leave after the service, she heard someone whisper, "No shame at all." Caleb's hand found hers, squeezing gently. They walked out with heads high, but Ruth saw the muscle jumping in his jaw. "We don't have to go back," he said once they were in the wagon. "We can worship at home." "No." Ruth's voice was fierce. "I won't let them drive us into hiding." Samuel began to fuss, and she lifted him to her breast, not caring who might see. "This is our home now, our community, whether they like it or not." But the social pressure took its toll. Ruth found herself excluded from the ladies' sewing circle she'd hoped to join. At the general store, conversations stopped when she entered. Even the children were kept from playing near the ranch. One evening, after a particularly difficult trip to town, Ruth found Caleb sitting on the porch, his head in his hands. "This is my fault," he said without looking up. "I should have known they'd punish you for my choices, for taking up with the widower who went half mad when his wife died." Ruth sat beside him, laying her hand on his knee. "You weren't mad. You were grieving. Same thing, in their eyes." He finally met her gaze, and she saw the old pain resurface. "After Margaret died, I did things, said things, cursed God in front of the whole congregation, told Reverend Thomas that his God was a liar who promised mercy but delivered only pain." "Oh, Caleb." "I spent months like a wild animal, drinking, fighting anyone who tried to help. It's a wonder I kept the ranch going." His voice dropped. "They're not just judging you for being with me too soon. They're judging you for being with me at all." Ruth moved closer, taking his face in her hands. "Then they're fools, because I see who you really are. A man who loved deeply and grieved just as deeply. A man who came back from the darkness. That takes more strength than they'll ever understand." He kissed her then, desperately, and they moved inside together, seeking comfort in each other's arms. But afterwards, as they lay entwined, Ruth sensed his lingering doubt. "Maybe we should wait," he said quietly. "Give them more time to adjust." "No." Ruth sat up, her eyes flashing. "We've waited long enough. Both of us. I won't let their small-mindedness dictate our lives." The next morning brought a new crisis. Ruth woke to find Caleb gone and a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to town. Back by noon. Stay inside." C, worried. She spent the morning trying to distract herself with chores, but her mind kept spinning terrible scenarios. When she finally heard his wagon returning, she rushed out to meet him. Reverend Thomas was with him. "Mrs. Whitmore," the Reverend said, climbing down awkwardly. "I'm afraid there's been concern raised about the propriety of your current living situation." Ruth's heart sank. "We're engaged. The wedding is set for next month." "Yes, well," the Reverend avoided her eyes. "Some members of the congregation feel that, given the circumstances, it would be more appropriate for you to live elsewhere until the ceremony, to avoid any appearance of impropriety." "Impropriety?" Caleb's voice was dangerously low. "We've done nothing improper." Ruth felt heat flood her cheeks. remembering all the nights they'd spent in each other's arms. But she kept her expression neutral. "I'm sure that's true," Reverend Thomas said hastily. "But for the sake of the community's peace, no." Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between Ruth and the minister. "I've bent to this community's will before. I let them tell me how to grieve, how long to mourn. I won't let them tell me how to love. Mr. Hartwell, please be reasonable. I am being reasonable. Ruth stays here, where she belongs. We'll marry when we planned, with or without the church's blessing." His voice carried the kind of finality that brooked no argument. "Now, Reverend, I believe you know the way back to town." After the minister left, Ruth found herself shaking. "Caleb, if they won't marry us, then we'll find someone who will, even if we have to ride to the next county." He pulled her into his arms. "I'm done caring what they think. Ruth, the only opinions that matter are ours and God's, and I have to believe he understands." That night, as if in response to the day's turmoil, a violent storm swept through the valley. Samuel woke crying, frightened by the thunder. They brought him into their bed, soothing him together. As the baby settled between them, Ruth watched Caleb's face in the lightning flashes. "Do you ever wonder if we're being punished?" she asked quietly. "For wanting happiness too soon?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, "No, I think we're being tested. Not by God, but by people who've forgotten what mercy looks like." He reached across Samuel to take her hand. "Every time I hold you, every time I see you with Samuel, I feel more certain this is right. That's not punishment. That's grace." The storm passed, leaving the morning air crystal clear. Ruth woke to find Caleb already up, Samuel in his arms as he stood by the window. "Look at that," he murmured to the baby. "See how the sun makes everything new? That's what your mama did for me, made everything new." Ruth's throat tightened with emotion. She rose and joined them, leaning into Caleb's solid warmth. Outside, the ranch sparkled with rain-washed beauty, indifferent to human judgment. "I have an idea," Caleb said suddenly. "What if we married ourselves? Here, on our land, with just God as witness?" Ruth looked up at him, surprised. "Can we do that?" "Why not? Marriage is between two people and God. The rest is just paperwork." His eyes were bright with possibility. "We could do it today. Make our promises to each other without all the folks who'd rather see us miserable. And later, for legal purposes, we'll find a justice of the peace eventually. But for us, for our hearts, why wait for permission from people who don't wish us well?" Ruth considered this. It was unconventional, even scandalous. But then, everything about their love had been unconventional. "Yes," she said finally. "Let's do it." They spent the morning preparing. Ruth wore her best dress, not black, but a soft blue that had belonged to Margaret. Caleb had offered it weeks ago, saying Margaret would want it used for joy, not packed away in sadness. He wore his Sunday clothes and picked wildflowers for her bouquet. As the sun reached its peak, they stood together beneath the cottonwoods Margaret had planted. Samuel gurgled happily in a basket at their feet, batting at the shadows of leaves. "I don't know the proper words," Caleb admitted. "Then use your own," Ruth said. He took her hands, his calloused palms warm against hers. "Ruth Whitmore, you came to me in winter, when my heart was frozen solid as the ground. You brought music and warmth and life back to this place. You showed me that love doesn't end with death. It just changes shape." His voice roughened. "I promise to protect you, provide for you, and cherish you all my days. I promise to be a father to Samuel and any other children God grants us. I promise to choose joy with you, even when sorrow comes calling." Ruth was crying openly now, but smiling through her tears. "Caleb Hartwell, you gave me shelter when I had none. You caught my son in your hands and breathed hope back into my heart. You showed me that broken people can make each other whole." She squeezed his hands. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to fill this house with laughter and song. I promise to love you not in spite of your scars, but because of how beautifully you've survived them." They kissed then, long and sweet, while Samuel babbled his approval. When they parted, Ruth felt something settle in her chest, a rightness that no amount of public censure could shake. Before God and our son. Caleb said, "We're married." "Yes," Ruth agreed. "We are." They spent the afternoon like newlyweds, stealing kisses between chores, touching at every opportunity. That evening, as they prepared supper together, Ruth realized the weight she'd been carrying had lifted. Let the town talk. Let the church disapprove. Here in this kitchen, with her husband and son, she had everything that mattered. The morning after their private ceremony dawned clear and bright. Ruth hummed as she prepared breakfast, feeling lighter than she had in months. Caleb came in from the early chores, pausing to kiss her temple, a casual intimacy that made her heart sing. "I need to ride to the Henderson place today," he said, pouring coffee. "Their bull got loose again. Might not be back until evening." "We'll be fine," Ruth assured him, bouncing Samuel on her hip. "I thought I'd start working on the garden plot. The soil's finally warm enough." Caleb smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Margaret always wanted a proper garden there. Never got around to it." "Well, now it will happen," Ruth said gently. Her dream and my work. After he left, Ruth bundled Samuel and set to work on the garden. The earth was rich and dark, promising good growing. She was so absorbed in her planning that she didn't hear the horses approaching until they were nearly upon her. 3 men sat mounted at the edge of the yard, rough-looking types she didn't recognize. The leader, a man with cold eyes and a scar across his jaw, touched his hat mockingly. "Afternoon, ma'am. Heard tell Caleb Hartwell got himself a woman. Didn't believe it myself." Ruth stood slowly, keeping Samuel close. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Oh, we're not here for help." The scarred man dismounted, his companions following suit. "Name's Jake Morrison. I used to work for Hartwell before he lost his mind and run me off. Figured it was time to collect what he owes me. If you have business with my husband, you'll need to wait for his return." Ruth kept her voice steady, though her heart raced. Morrison laughed, an ugly sound. "Husband? That's rich. Whole town knows you're just his kept woman, living in sin with a madman who cursed God himself." Ruth lifted her chin. "You're mistaken, Mr. Morrison. Now I'll ask you to leave. Ask all you want." He stepped closer, and Ruth could smell whiskey on his breath. "But first, maybe you can tell us where Hartwell keeps his cash. Man owes me 2 months' wages, plus interest for my troubles." "He owes you nothing." Ruth backed toward the house, but one of the other men moved to block her path. "See, that's where you're wrong." Morrison's smile was predatory. "Man can't just fire honest workers 'cause he's grieving. There's consequences. You were fired for stealing." Caleb's voice came from behind them, cold as winter wind. He sat atop his horse at the ranch entrance, rifle across his saddle. "And for being drunk on the job. Now get off my land." Morrison turned slowly, his hand drifting toward his gun. Well, the grieving widower returns. Didn't expect you back so soon. Henderson's bull was already penned. Seemed suspicious. So I circled back." Caleb's eyes never left Morrison's face. "Smart move. Ruth, keeping them talking." Ruth realized he'd been watching, waiting for the right moment. Relief flooded through her. "We just want what's owed," Morrison said. But his bravado had dimmed. "Only thing owed is a bullet if you don't mount up and ride out. Now." Caleb shifted the rifle slightly. "And if you come near my wife or son again, I'll forget I'm trying to be a better man." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Morrison spat in the dirt and gestured to his men. "This ain't over. Hartwell." "Yes, it is." Caleb's voice carried absolute certainty. "Don't make me prove it." After they rode off, Caleb dismounted and pulled Ruth into his arms, Samuel between them. She could feel him trembling, not with fear, but with controlled rage. "Did they touch you?" "No, just threats and ugly words." Ruth pulled back to look at him. "How did you know?" Henderson mentioned seeing strangers in town, asking about the ranch. Had a bad feeling. He cupped her face in his hands. I should have warned you. Should have been here. You were here when it mattered, Ruth assured him. That's enough. But the encounter had shaken them both. That night, Caleb cleaned his rifle and checked the locks twice before coming to bed. When Ruth reached for him, he pulled her close almost desperately. I can't lose you, he whispered against her hair. Can't go through that again. You won't, Ruth promised, though she knew neither of them could guarantee such things. The next morning brought new trouble in the form of a legal notice, delivered by a nervous-looking clerk from town. Caleb read it, his face darkening. Morrison's filed a complaint with the territorial judge. Says I owe him wages and damages for unlawful termination. He crumpled the paper. He's trying to force a settlement. Can he do that? He can try. Judge Harlan's fair, but... Caleb rubbed his face. I'll need to go to the county seat, present my side. Could take days. Then we'll go together, Ruth said firmly. All of us. Caleb shook his head. Road's too rough for Samuel, and Morrison's still out there. I won't risk it. They argued, but Ruth eventually conceded. The thought of Caleb leaving, even for a few days, filled her with dread she couldn't quite name. 2 days later, he prepared to depart. Ruth packed food for his journey, trying to ignore the anxiety clawing at her chest. As he loaded his saddlebags, she noticed him tucking something into his coat, a small Bible she'd never seen him carry before. For luck? She asked softly. For strength, he corrected. To remember who I'm trying to be now, not who I was. He kissed her goodbye at the door, lingering as if memorizing the moment. Bar the doors at night. Keep the rifle handy. If Morrison comes back, I'll handle it, Ruth promised. Just come back to us. Always. He kissed Samuel's head, then Ruth once more. Few days at most. Try not to burn down the ranch while I'm gone. She tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. Something felt wrong about this parting, though she couldn't say what. The first night alone passed peacefully. Ruth kept busy with chores and Samuel's needs, falling into bed exhausted. But the second night, she woke to the sound of breaking glass. Fire! The barn was on fire. Ruth grabbed Samuel and the rifle. Racing outside, flames were already consuming the hayloft. Spreading fast, the horses screamed in terror, trapped in their stalls. Without thinking, Ruth thrust Samuel into his basket on the porch and ran for the barn. Smoke burned her lungs as she fumbled with latches, freeing the panicked animals one by one. The roof groaned ominously overhead. She'd just released the last horse when a figure emerged from the smoke. Morrison, his face twisted with satisfaction. Accidents happen, he said. Shame Hartwell ain't here to watch his place burn. Ruth raised the rifle, but he knocked it from her hands. She fought him, savage as any cornered animal. But he was stronger. He backed her against the barn wall, one hand at her throat. Maybe I'll take more than money, he snarled. Teach Hartwell what it costs to cross me. The world was going dark when she heard it. Hoofbeats, thundering into the yard. Morrison turned just as Caleb burst from his horse, tackling the man with bone-crushing force. The fight was brutal, but brief. Caleb's fury was a terrible thing. Years of grief and rage focused on the man who'd threatened his family. When Morrison finally lay unconscious in the dirt, Caleb turned to Ruth, his chest heaving. How? She gasped. Felt wrong. Leaving. Turned back at Miller's Creek. He pulled her into his arms, both of them shaking. Thank God. Thank God I listened. Together, they fought the fire, forming a bucket line from the well. Neighbors arrived. Word of the smoke had traveled fast, and suddenly the yard was full of helping hands. Even those who'd shunned them came to fight the flames. By dawn, the barn was gone, but the fire was out. Morrison had been hauled to jail by the sheriff, who'd arrived with the fire brigade. As the sun rose over the blackened ruins, Ruth and Caleb stood surrounded by their neighbors, everyone soot-stained and exhausted. We owe you thanks, Caleb said stiffly to the assembled crowd. "All of you. Mrs. Fletcher," her usually pristine dress now filthy with ash, sniffed. "Well, couldn't let the whole valley burn for the sake of propriety." Her eyes softened slightly. "Besides, any woman who'd run into a burning barn to save horses, perhaps we've misjudged." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was a start. In the days that followed, the community's attitude shifted. Men arrived with lumber to rebuild. Women brought food and offered to help with Samuel while Ruth and Caleb worked on plans. The shared crisis had broken down walls that judgment had built. Maybe that's what it took, Ruth mused one evening, watching their neighbors' wagons depart after another day of barn raising. A fire to burn away the old grudges. Maybe. Caleb agreed, pulling her close. Or maybe they just finally saw what I see. A woman worth fighting for. They stood together in the doorway of their home, Samuel sleeping peacefully inside, the skeleton of the new barn rising from the ashes of the old. It wasn't the ending to their troubles. Morrison would still need to be dealt with legally, and some in town would never fully accept them. But it was a beginning. "No more leaving," Caleb said quietly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," Ruth agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of smoke and hope and home. The new barn stood complete by early July, testament to what a community could accomplish when united. As the final board was nailed into place, Caleb stood back with satisfaction, his arm around Ruth's waist. Samuel, now crawling with determined speed, explored the fresh sawdust at their feet. "It's time," Caleb said quietly. "We need to make this official in the eyes of the law." Ruth nodded. Their private ceremony beneath the cottonwoods had bound their hearts, but legal protection required more. With Morrison's trial approaching and property rights to consider, they couldn't delay any longer. "I've spoken with Reverend Thomas," Caleb continued. "He's agreed to perform the ceremony, despite some ongoing objections from certain congregation members." The next Sunday, they stood before the church altar, Ruth in Margaret's blue dress and Caleb in his best suit. The pews were fuller than expected. The fire had shifted many hearts, though not all. Mrs. Fletcher sat in the front row, her expression pinched but present. Other faces showed varying degrees of acceptance, curiosity, or lingering disapproval. Samuel rested in the arms of Mrs. Henderson, who'd volunteered to hold him during the ceremony. The older woman had become an unexpected ally, her own long widowhood giving her sympathy for Ruth's situation. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat, his kind face showing the strain of recent weeks. "Dearly beloved, we gather today to witness the union of Caleb Hartwell and Ruth Whitmore. Though some have questioned the timing and propriety of this match, I have counseled with both parties and found their commitment sincere and their hearts prepared." A murmur ran through the congregation. Ruth kept her eyes on Caleb's face, drawing strength from his steady gaze. "Marriage," the Reverend continued, raising his voice slightly, "is not entered into lightly. It requires forgiveness of oneself and others. It demands that we release the past while honoring what came before. Both Ruth and Caleb have loved and lost. That they choose to love again is not weakness, but courage." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at his words. She saw several women dabbing handkerchiefs, moved despite themselves. When it came time for objections, the church held its breath. A man in the back half rose, then sat again at his wife's sharp elbow. The moment passed. "Caleb, do you take Ruth to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do." His voice rang clear and certain. "Ruth, do you take Caleb to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do." The rings? Caleb produced 2 bands, his mother's for Ruth, and a new one she'd had made from a gold coin of Samuel's, one of the few things saved from their previous life. As they exchanged them, Ruth caught Caleb wiping his eyes with his free hand. "By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Their kiss was brief but tender, mindful of the watching crowd. But as they turned to face the congregation as a married couple, Samuel chose that moment to let out a delighted shriek, reaching for them with chubby arms. Laughter rippled through the church, genuine, warm laughter. Mrs. Henderson carried the baby to them, and they stood as a family while Reverend Thomas offered the final blessing. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard near the new barn. It was simple fare, whatever neighbors could contribute, but the atmosphere was lighter than any gathering Ruth had attended since arriving in the valley. Even those who'd been coldest began to thaw, especially when Samuel charmed them with his newly discovered ability to clap. As the sun began to set, casting golden light over the assembled company, Caleb stood to speak. The crowd quieted. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his hand finding Ruth's. "But I need to say something. 2 years ago, I stood in this community and cursed God for taking my Margaret. I said things I regret, did things I'm ashamed of. Many of you tried to help, and I pushed you away." He paused, gathering himself. Then Ruth came. In the middle of the worst winter I can remember. She didn't try to fix me or preach at me. She just lived, sang in my kitchen, brought life back to a dead house, showed me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. Ruth squeezed his hand, her throat tight with emotion. "I know some of you think we've moved too fast, broken too many rules. Maybe we have, but sometimes broken people need to make their own rules to become whole again." He looked out at the faces, some sympathetic, some still skeptical. "All I ask is that you judge us by how we live from here on, not by how we got here." He sat down to scattered applause, which grew when Samuel decided to contribute his own babbling commentary. The ice hadn't completely melted, but it was cracking. Later, as the last wagons rolled away under the stars, Ruth and Caleb sat on their porch, Samuel finally asleep in his cradle inside. The day had been everything they'd hoped and feared, imperfect but real. "Any regrets?" Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Only one," Ruth said, then smiled at his concerned look. "I wish we'd done this sooner." He laughed, pulling her closer. "Woman, you'll be the death of me yet." "No," she said seriously, turning to face him. "I'll be the life of you, just as you are mine." They sealed the promise with a kiss that held all the sweetness of new love and all the depth of souls who'd walked through shadow to find light. Over the following weeks, their marriage settled into rhythms both new and familiar. The community's acceptance came in small doses, an invitation to join the Harvest Committee, a request for Ruth to help teach Sunday school, neighbors stopping by with less suspicion and more genuine friendliness. The trial of Jake Morrison provided an unexpected turning point when Caleb testified about the attempted arson and assault, with Ruth corroborating and several neighbors confirming Morrison's threats in town. Public opinion shifted firmly in their favor. Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, and suddenly the Hartwells were seen not as scandalous outcasts, but as survivors of a criminal's vendetta. Funny how being victims makes us more acceptable. Ruth mused one evening, sorting through a basket of baby clothes donated by the Church Ladies Auxiliary, a group that had finally extended her an invitation to join. "I'll take acceptance any way it comes." Caleb replied pragmatically, "Pride's a luxury we can't afford." But the greatest joy came in the small moments, Caleb teaching Samuel to walk, his large hands gentle as he guided tiny steps. Ruth finding Margaret's recipe box and learning to make her famous apple preserves, feeling the blessing of continuity rather than competition. The three of them attending church together, no longer pariahs but simply another family in the community of faith. One August evening, as they prepared for bed, Ruth felt the familiar flutter in her belly, different this time, new life rather than Samuel's remembered movements. She caught Caleb's hand and placed it on her stomach. "Again?" he asked, wonder in his voice. "Again," she confirmed. "Spring, I think." He knelt before her, pressing his lips to her belly through her nightgown. "Hello, little one. Your papa's here." Ruth ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed by the fullness of their life. "Are you happy?" He looked up at her, his eyes bright with tears. "Happy doesn't cover it. Ruth, I'm alive because of you. I'm alive." That night, as they held each other in their marriage bed, Ruth thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain hadn't disappeared. She still grieved Samuel, still missed the life she'd planned with him. Caleb still visited Margaret's grave, still kept her picture on the mantel. But alongside the grief grew something else. Not replacement, but addition. Love expanding rather than replacing. "I want to do something," Caleb said into the darkness. "For the church, for the community. Something to mark our gratitude." "What did you have in mind?" "A bell," he said. "The church needs a bell." Margaret always said so. Said a church without a bell was like a body without a voice. "I want to commission one. From both of us. From all of us." Ruth turned to kiss him. She was right. And yes, let's do it. Let's give the church its voice. As sleep took them, Samuel stirred in his cradle, babbling contentedly. Outside, the Wyoming night stretched vast and peaceful over their ranch. The new barn stood strong against the darkness, built by community hands. Inside the house, new life grew while old wounds healed. They were home. 5 years had transformed the Hartwell Ranch into something unrecognizable from the desolate place Ruth had first encountered. The house, once silent as a tomb, now rang with children's laughter. Samuel, approaching his 6th birthday, raced through the yard with his younger sister Emma, a spirited 4-year-old with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Baby Thomas, just learning to walk, toddled after them with determined steps. Ruth stood at the kitchen window, her hand resting on her belly where another child grew. She watched Caleb teaching Samuel to rope, patient as always with the boy who called him Papa without hesitation. The years had softened the harsh lines of grief on Caleb's face, though silver now touched his temples. "Mama, look!" Emma burst through the door, holding a handful of wildflowers. "For the table. They're beautiful, sweetheart." Ruth helped her daughter arrange them in a jar, remembering another bouquet, another life that seemed a lifetime ago. The church bell they donated rang out across the valley, calling folks to Sunday service. It had become a cherished sound, marking not just worship but weddings, births, and farewells. The inscription on the bell read, "In memory of those we've lost, in hope for those who remain, donated by the Hartwell family." As they prepared for church, Ruth noticed Caleb standing by the cottonwood trees, now tall enough to provide real shade. She knew he was having his weekly conversation with Margaret, updating her on the children, the ranch, the life that had grown from the ashes of grief. Ruth had her own rituals. Samuel's birthday always included a quiet moment of remembrance for his father, stories told to keep his memory alive. "Ready?" Caleb asked, returning to help wrangle the children into the wagon. "Thomas needs changing first," Ruth said, then swayed slightly. Caleb steadied her immediately, concern creasing his brow. "You're doing too much again." "I'm fine," she assured him, though she allowed him to take the baby. Just the heat. At church, they took their usual pew, no longer in the back but among the congregation. Mrs. Fletcher, now one of Ruth's closest friends after years of gradual thawing, scooted over to make room. The transformation in the community's acceptance had been slow but complete. Ruth now led the children's Sunday school, while Caleb served on the church board. Reverend Thomas, grayer but still kind, began his sermon on the parable of the mustard seed. "The smallest seed," he said, "growing into the largest tree. So it is with faith, with hope, with love. What seems impossible in our darkest moments can flourish beyond our wildest dreams." Ruth felt Caleb's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining. They'd lived that parable, watched love grow from the frozen ground of grief. After service, the congregation gathered for a potluck. Children ran between the tables while adults discussed crops, weather, and the new families moving into the valley. The Hartwells were woven into the fabric of the community now, their scandalous beginning mostly forgotten. "Ruth," young Mary Patterson approached, belly round with her first child. "I was hoping you could help with the delivery when my time comes. Everyone says you're the best midwife in the valley." Ruth smiled. She'd discovered her calling in helping bring new life into the world, trained by old Doc Martin and proven through dozens of successful deliveries. "Of course, Mary, send word when the pains start." As they loaded the children back into the wagon for the trip home, Samuel asked, "Papa, can we visit the graves?" Caleb glanced at Ruth, who nodded. It was a ritual they'd established, honoring the past while celebrating the present. The small cemetery behind the house now held 2 markers. Margaret's cross stood weathered but tended, fresh flowers at its base. Beside it, a newer stone marked a small grave, baby Grace, who'd lived only 3 days the previous winter. The loss had tested them, but they'd weathered it together, drawing on hard-won strength. "Hello, Margaret," Samuel said solemnly, placing a flower on each grave. "Emma lost another tooth this week. Thomas is walking real good now." Ruth watched her son, Samuel's son, speak naturally to the woman who'd never met him but whose memory was honored in their home. It shouldn't work. This blended family built on loss and second chances. But somehow it did. That evening, after the children were asleep, Ruth and Caleb sat on their porch as they did most nights. The ranch spread before them, the barn rebuilt stronger than before, gardens flourishing, cattle grazing peacefully. But it was the small things that marked their success: children's toys scattered in the yard, laundry dancing on the line, the smell of bread rising for tomorrow's breakfast. "I've been thinking," Caleb said, his arm around her shoulders, "about adding onto the house again. With this new one coming, we'll make room," Ruth said, leaning into his warmth. "We always do." He was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "Do you ever wonder what they'd think, Samuel and Margaret, about all this?" Ruth considered the question, one they'd wrestled with less frequently as the years passed. "I think they'd be glad we didn't let grief win, that their love prepared us to love again. Margaret would have liked you," Caleb said, "would have loved seeing the house so full of life. Samuel would have respected you." Ruth replied, "How you've cared for his son, given him a good life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Inside, one of the children stirred, and Ruth started to rise, but Caleb pressed her back down. "I'll check," he said, kissing her forehead. "You rest." She watched him go. This man who'd been half dead when she met him, now so fully alive. Through the window, she could see him adjusting Emma's blanket, his movements tender as any mother's. When he returned, he brought her shawl, wrapping it around her shoulders as the evening cooled. "Temperatures dropping. Might have an early frost. We're ready for it," Ruth said. And they were. Root cellar full, wood stacked high, love enough to warm them through any winter. A coyote called in the distance, and its mate answered. Wild voices in the darkness that no longer seemed threatening but simply part of the landscape of their lives. Ruth thought of that first terrible winter. How impossible this moment would have seemed. Yet here they sat, battle-scarred but victorious, proof that hearts could break and mend and grow stronger at the seams. "Come on," Caleb said, helping her to her feet. "Let's go in. Tomorrow's a full day." "They all are," Ruth agreed, grateful for each one. Inside their home, children slept peacefully. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the day's baking. Margaret's picture smiled from the mantel, joined now by one of Samuel, and newer images, their wedding, the children at various ages, the family complete and growing. As they prepared for bed, Ruth caught sight of herself in Margaret's old mirror. No longer the desperate widow who'd arrived in a blizzard, but a woman who'd found her place, her purpose, her unexpected second love. The face looking back bore lines of laughter and loss, joy and sorrow, all woven into something beautiful in its complexity. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, arms encircling her from behind. "That we did it," she said simply. "We survived. More than survived. We lived," he agreed, his hand moving to rest on her swollen belly. "And we're not done yet." Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, gentle as a blessing. But inside the Hartwell house, all was warmth and light and love, a testament to the miraculous truth that broken hearts could indeed learn to beat again, stronger for having been shattered and remade. The Wild West had tested them with its harsh winters and unforgiving landscape, with judgment and loss and seemingly impossible odds. But it had also given them this, a love story written not in perfection but in perseverance, proof that sometimes the best families are the ones built from the beautiful wreckage of what came before. Thank you all for listening to this tale of love, loss, and redemption in the Wyoming frontier. I hope Ruth and Caleb's journey touched your hearts as much as it touched mine in the telling. Where are you listening to this story right now? Perhaps curled up by your own fire? Or maybe on a long drive through country, not unlike the Wind River Range. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what resonated with you in this story of two broken souls finding wholeness together. Until next time, partners, keep the campfire burning and the stories flowing.